Hi, everyone. My name is Franz Hartmann. I'm the Executive Director of Earthroots Canada. Welcome to Earthroots Provincial Election 2022 video podcast, episode number 6. With me today is Gord Miller, Earthroots Chair and former Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, and some great Earthroots supporters. Welcome, Gord, and everyone. For those of you joining us live today, and for those watching this on the Earthroots Coalition YouTube page, we've got 5 other episodes covering a range of topics about the environment and the June 2nd provincial election. And today is our last episode, and we've got something special. Participants will be asking Gord questions and have already sent in questions about the environment and Thursday's election. And for those of you who are joining us live, please use the chat function to pose your question or comment, and I'll do my best to get to them in the order that I receive them. But first, we're going to start with a few questions that have already been submitted. But I do know that Gord wants to say something about party platforms. So Gord, why don't you start there, and then I'll get to the first question.
Franz. We had some questions come in about what are the party platforms, that sort of thing. Well, it's not our intention to get into the politics of it. My depth of background, I've had 40 years in environmental work. I have a good perspective on things, and I should be useful in answering your questions. But if you want to know about the individual party platforms, you really got to go to the party websites and check each one out yourself. And so that way I don't get accidentally cause any favoritism or perspective of favoritism. Please go check them out. They're not, I've looked at them all myself, and there's not a lot of substance. Let's put it that way. It won't take you long. But by all means, if you want the party politics, go to the party websites.
Right. Okay, we had a number of questions, over a dozen actually submitted to us beforehand. So we're going to try to get through as many of those as we can. And the first one, and I'm not identifying individuals because I didn't get people's permission to use their names. So just generic questions from Earthroots supporters. First one takes us to Central Ontario, the Parry Sound area. What has Ontario done regarding the rapid extinction of iconic woodland caribou in northwestern Ontario? Gord.
Oh, Central Ontario. That's northwestern Ontario.
Oh, that's right. My apologies. No, yeah, that is the north.
So, Toronto guy, I'll tell you about what's happening up in the north. Up in northwestern Ontario, now, of course, the woodland caribou is a threatened species identified in Ontario. It's quite native. It's been around for thousands of years, but as human encroachment has moving further and further north, it's been disappearing. There's records tracking this disappearance as basically as as the forestry gets up to an area, there's a complex relationship. But nonetheless, as forestry comes and clears some forest, changes the vegetation, changes the moose and wolf dynamic, the caribou and the ones in the boreal forest that are threatened species, and they're disappearing and have been consistently. So the question is, what has Ontario done regarding the rapid extinctions of the iconic woodland caribou? Well, it is, and the reason I say and ask about Northern Ontario, because that's pretty much all that's left. There are still some in the east, but the majority of the surviving caribou are in the northwest. And the story is not a good one with respect to Ontario's behavior. There are threatened species under the Endangered Species Act, pardon me, and but the Ontario regulates the forestry activity in the forest under the Crown Forest Sustainability Act, and of course they fairly recently, about a year and a half ago, they removed the Endangered Species Act from its functioning within the Crown Forest Sustainability Act. So in other words, the forestry plans don't have to follow the Endangered Species Act. So interesting situation. And that's led to a challenge by various environmental groups saying, well, wait a minute. So we have a threatened species, recognized as a federal threatened species as well as a provincial threatened species, but the Ontario has basically backed off administering the act in the forestry activities. So what happens in this curiosity of Canadian and Ontario law is that normally on provincial lands of the province has the responsibility for endangered species. But if they fail to do their responsibility, which in this case it is alleged they have, and certainly I would think so, then you can petition the federal government under the federal Species at Risk Act to intervene on a special status as a federal agency, saying, well, if the province isn't doing it, it falls to us and we'll do it. And that's the process that's going on now. The environmental groups have petitioned and pursued. The federal government is shying away. As far as I know, it's not settled yet. But the pressure is on the federal government to say, you must step in because the province has not lived up to its responsibility. So that's where it stands. Very unusual case. As far as I know, it's the only situation like this and it happened anywhere in Canada, that it's necessary to go to the federal government to get them to do the job of the province, but it goes on.
Wow. So Gord, just to pick up on that for a moment, let's say that the federal government were to decide to intervene. Is it possible that the province of Ontario could take the feds to court, saying, you're stepping on our kind of provincial toes, and you shouldn't be able to do this? Because we know that
it absolutely is, because it's Canada is very complex in the law, in the sense that we do have a confederation of provinces. And there's, in our constitution, there's separation of responsibilities, and managing provincial lands and managing wildlife is clearly a provincial responsibility, unless there's a sort of pressing Canadian interest in this, which is what they would argue it is the case. Then the federal government can intervene. But there's no question it's controversial in the province. Well, we saw that when the present Conservative government came in and didn't want to sue the federal government with respect to the carbon tax proposal. They say, well, that's our responsibility and you can't do it. Now, in fact, on that carbon tax one, the province lost, but you saw that kind of action in court case and resistance to the battle of jurisdictions. It hasn't got, in case of endangered species, it hasn't got to the courts yet on that level, but it is a possibility.
Right. So bottom line, Ontario, the province has not done a lot regarding the rapid extinction of Canada's iconic woodland caribou in northern Ontario, northwestern Ontario.
Well, they've done less than not enough.
No. and fingers crossed that the feds will step in. Anyway, we'll see what happens after June 2nd. Yeah. So let's go to the second question. This is the one that's in central Ontario. My apologies. I do know that northwestern Ontario is in the northwest. Is there a risk of mercury contamination after the Parry Sound 33 fire due to massive erosion? And Gord, maybe you could just let viewers know about what was the Parry Sound 33 fire?
Back in 2018, there were two very, very large forest fires. One was up north of Temagami, and the other one was in Parry Sound 33. They're very large, very hot forest fires. Burnt out. In fact, the Parry Sound fire burnt a lot of recreational buildings, as well as huge amounts of forest. And we have at least one person on from the Georgian Bay here, and people who have been around the Georgian Bay, and the soils are very shallow on top of rock, or those beautiful scenic Georgian Bay shorelines with the rock outcrops, multicolored in some cases. But it gives you a sense that rock is not far down, and then there's a layer of soil / organic matter that the trees root in. And what happened with that fire, it was so big and so hot that it actually scorched right through the organic layer in the soil as it destroyed the forest, and then left the soil very prone to erosion just in the rain, because now all of a sudden the organic matter is gone from the soil, and the soils in a lot of area have washed into Georgian Bay, or the tributaries flowing into Georgian Bay. So there's a lot of erosion. It's very unusual. It hasn't happened in hundreds of years of that severity. And the question is, people have raised the point, well, we know that, in the case where soils, especially in Northern Ontario, wash into waterways, they carry residual mercury that's fallen out of the atmosphere and collected in the soil for many, many years, largely from the burning of coal, but nonetheless over more than 100 years. And what happens to that mercury? Does it become active? And the answer is, it probably does. The mercury, the soil will go in and wash down into the sediments. Once it begins down there in the sediments, there's not much oxygen. You get anaerobic activity, as they call it. And bacteria have the characteristic of being able to methylize the mercury and make it from an inorganic mercury element to an organic Now, a compound or molecule that has the mercury, it makes it mobile in the living cycle. So there is a concern, but the only way you can really get a handle on it or look for it is in the fish, because it takes a while to become methylated. It takes a while to work its way up into the food chain, and it tends to concentrate in the fish. Is where first of all, where we don't want it to be, because that's where human beings interact with the mercury and the contamination. But as well, I mean, that's where you have to look to see if it's happening and to what severity it's happening. Now, it's a real issue, but really the only way you can get a handle on it is regularly sampling of the fish. Now, the province does sample fish generally, and a number of sample lakes across the province, but it's expensive, and they don't go to the lakes every year. But the only way they're going to get a handle on this one is if they regularly sample the fish tissue for mercury to see if it is a real problem, or if it hasn't developed, or if enough of the soil is washed out into the Georgian Bay that it will escape developing and getting into the fish. So we don't know. It's not something you can easily, it's an expensive proposition to monitor mercury in fish. The province has the capacity, but you have to basically get them to do it. And as far as I know, there's certainly no extra extensive project other than the regular program of monitoring fish around the province. So, but that's really the only solution. Look in the fish, go to, catch some fish, take some flesh samples and analyze it thoroughly. And then you'll know if the mercury is causing a problem or not.
Right. And I don't have a science background or a natural science background, so I'll ask a question which perhaps shows how little I know about science. But does the mercury just kind of float in the water if you have if you've got
No,
your water comes from Georgian Bay? Will it end up in your cup of water?
No, it won't. That's the thing. It's because mercury itself is extremely low solubility. It doesn't become in the water. It's not soluble in the water, but it goes in molecular form, just as mercury atoms, and lives down there in the sludge and the mud down at the bottom, and it becomes, by bacteria, make it methylated, add organic matter to it. So now it becomes biologically active. Now it'll be as an organic molecule, but it doesn't float up through the water. You can't drink it and get it. It goes through, the benthic organisms, the worms and the invertebrates that live down there, and they're eaten by the fish. And then once it gets in fish tissue, it's very hard for the fish to excrete it. It tends to collect in the tissue of the fish. So it's not a water quality problem. You can't ever find it in the water. It's in the fish. Like, the classic case is grassy narrows, which people may have heard about. That in that case, it's gross amounts of mercury that came in from the pulp and paper operation, but nonetheless, where did it show up? It showed up in the fish, and it showed up in the indigenous people that were eating the fish, and to their detriment, right, to their health, their serious health implications.
Yeah. Which is a bit of a precursor of what our future might look like, because there will likely be more forest fires, and that might create more mercury, especially in places where there's shield country, more mercury going into the
in
water
shield country,
systems.
it's sort of unique there, but where you do see it is, and it has been demonstrated, is if you build big hydroelectric dams and they flood a lot of forest. This gentleman just came on my screen. He's watching. He's illustrating in his background exactly what I'm talking about in Georgian Bay, in terms of the rock and the trees being very shallow rooted.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's move on to another kind of pollution issue. This question is about the pandemic, and the fact that the pandemic created a whole bunch of non-recyclable or nor reusable garbage. I mean, I think we've all experienced, you go to a parking lot, you see these masks lying all over the place, and a whole bunch of other things. The question is, what can we do differently during the next health challenge, or in our current health institutions, to replace needed PPEs with reusables?
Well, I don't know.
Would you mind if I asked a quick question about the mercury thing?
Sure. Yeah, please do.
Hi, Gord. Good to see you. It's been a while.
Yeah.
One of our directors, Andy Metelka, I don't know if you know him, is currently looking into the way mercury testing is done by the MECP, and has basically determined that they're not doing it in the right way.
Oh.
And
That's
also
interesting.
that that they're not doing it. They're not doing very much testing anyway. At the moment, there's been a bit of a dearth on that front. So we are currently looking into that and coming up with we want to do a study to do the testing properly and see what's really going on at that. Obviously, our focus is Georgian Bay. But it is a problem that MECP are not testing in inshore sediment, which is where the mercury is likely to be. They're testing in deeper water, which is virtually useless because you're not going to find much mercury out there. So we are concerned that the information that's currently out there is inaccurate and underplaying the extent of mercury contamination in fish. And it is, of course, particularly important for our indigenous friends. So just wanted to register that.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
So we're back to
the
the pandemic.
pandemic and the fact that a lot of personal protective equipment is designed to be single use and thrown out. How do we deal with that?
Well, it's an interesting question because, of course, the whole issue of when you get into this kind of waste, reusables is a very difficult thing. That's why, in the hospitals, there's tremendous amounts of waste. They tend to segregate it into three types. And what's sort of implied or implicit in this question is the fact that when you're in hospital and you're contagious with something and they put a mask on you, presumably the pathogen is captured in that mask, and that becomes pathological waste, which is the most rigorously controlled waste from hospitals because it can transmit disease from handling or exposed to things. What do we do with our stuff? We throw it in the parking lot of Costco, right? Because that's where you see it. People, now, mind you, that's only a major problem for people who are symptomatic with the disease. But still, as far as I know, there was no collection of pathological waste from people who are actually sympathetic, actually had COVID and were displaying the symptoms, and therefore they're breathing through these masks. These masks were dangerous in the perspective in terms of that they're vectors of disease, and we had no collection, no advice on how to manage that. It was completely absent, which I thought was very strange. In fact, I had a friend of mine who, at the very start of the COVID thing, his company was going to get into masks at the time, and I said, "Oh, well, geez, there'll be some issues about pathological disease." "Oh, no, they don't care." I said, "Well, what do you mean they don't care?" So that's really the risks there. The fact that making them recyclable or reusable is highly problematic. Maybe the gowns, but then you have to get into a washing cycle. But certainly the masks, I don't think anybody has a reusable technology with respect to masks. But we certainly in the future, because that's part of the question, if we're going to have these, unfortunately, have these kind of pandemics or epidemics within the country, they have to advise people properly how to handle and dispose of such PPE, because it has inherently a risk associated with it. So it's got to have special handling.
And I think this gets to actually another question about the waste management system in Ontario, which has got a lot of problems. When one of them you just mentioned. This question from a person who recently moved into a new condo in Toronto and found out that it has very poor private recycling and organics disposal. In fact, the person noted, "I understand the private companies pick up and send everything to landfill." In other words, they don't actually have any recycling. They do not have any green bin pickup. The person writes, "There is supposed to be provincial oversight on this, but I understand they basically don't enforce it. How can these companies be compelled to recycle and send organics to composting?" So now we're going from some pathogenous stuff to our daily household recyclables and green bins that are ending up in landfills. Gord, what can be done?
Well, lots can be done if they wish, because there's a little bit of a trick being pulled by the province, if you like, because remember all the concern about landfill waste from Toronto or the GTA going to Michigan, going back some years now. But it was a big concern, and finally the city of Toronto bought Green Lane landfill around London, and now they assure everybody, oh no, all our recyclables go to recycling plants. Our regular waste goes to a properly run landfill, and our green bin stuff goes to either composting or more likely the digestion and anaerobic digesters. And they say, oh, there you are. So, you know, we're in good shape on the waste. But the reality is that's only about half the waste. The municipally governed waste is only about half the waste. The commercial waste is the waste, you know, like, remember we used to go to the malls. Well, remember when we used to go to malls? We haven't been to the malls in the last couple of years. But when there used to be bins for recyclables at malls, and most of those have disappeared now. Well, that's commercial waste. That's about half the waste produced. 50% is residential related waste, and 50% of all the waste is commercial. And that would include the apartment buildings that they're the condo buildings that which are not serviced by the city. They're serviced by hired commercial haulers. And what's been happening, because of no attention being paid to this, the commercial haulers get a contract to haul the stuff. They often separate the recyclables, and then they haul the garbage, and they get paid, you know, for doing that service to commercial buildings and condo buildings and things and such. But as soon as it's gone, they mix it and they send it to Michigan, because it's not going through the recycling is not going through the municipal recycling system, and the other waste is just going in usually Michigan or some other usually American site, because the same level of rules, a different set of rules apply. Now there are rules they have to follow, but the Ministry of Environment has not been enforcing those rules, not a top for years. They passed regulations at one time, and the Ministry of Environment had regulations that said for these commercial activities, there had to be waste reduction plans for every kind of organization, every kind of thing which had to reduce the volume of waste each year. They had to have segregated recycling, but they don't say what happens to that recycling. And in fact, the people who know how to, the big people who are processing recycling materials are municipalities. And if the municipality is not responsible for it, a commercial hauler picks it up. They just get rid of it somehow. So it's not the intent of the law. It's not the details of the law. It's due to lack of enforcement by the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks now, because basically they've pulled the wool over everybody's eyes and said, we just ignored the problem, and for over 20 years now, this has been happening. So somebody's got to raise a fuss with the ministry and with the public and ask some questions and get something done, because the solution is at hand. These companies can be made to do the proper thing and divert the waste in the proper way, but if nobody's enforcing, it'll never be done.
Yeah. And I will just let the listeners know, in Toronto at least, there are a growing number of condominiums where the residents have gotten together and said, you know what, we're going to do waste diversion on our own. And they've created some very successful programs. Former group that I used to work with, Toronto Environmental Alliance, they've got some really neat programs that they've been developing where they help condo owners and condo boards do the sort of waste diversion that, frankly, the province should be enforcing. But there are other tools in the citizen toolbox there as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. But even those tools, even if the citizens took a bigger role in this, it would still needs the enforcement of the Ministry of Environment to make this happen. Yeah. And they're getting away with this, and it's inappropriate, and they shouldn't be happening.
Yeah. So let's go back to Northern Ontario. And before I do that, just for those who have joined us live, if you do have any questions or comments, feel free to use the chat function, and I'll get to those. Back to Northern Ontario, what environmental regulations might exist for Northwestern Ontario, specifically related to the forestry industry and mining sectors?
The thing is, there's Northwestern Ontario again. There are, of course, a variety of regulations. The forest industry is run by the Crown Forest Sustainability Act, and there are forest management plans. It's an elaborate process, and that's the overall governing rules on the forestry industry. Mining industry has a large number of regulations, and they apply, of course, anywhere on provincial land throughout the province, not just in the Northwest. But there is an interesting thing happening, and I suspect the reason we got this question is something unique happens in Northwestern Ontario that basically people don't understand. I found out when I was commissioner, I went up to Northwestern Ontario. I've always worked on forestry issues and forest management planning, and I know a great deal about that. When I was up in Northwestern Ontario this time, we were giving a talk on forest management, and I started getting questions, and people were quite upset. Well, wait a minute, you're saying they're doing this kind of forest management. They're not doing that. They're just massively clear cutting. And I said, that's strange. What we got some details and such, and it something actually I knew, but I forgot or didn't realize in context, was that large portions of land in Northwestern Ontario are privately owned by the big companies. And the rules for forest management, the Crown Forest Sustainability Act, don't apply on private land. Now you see that large tracts in the Northwest. There's some tracts in more in central Northern Ontario, but large tracts in the Northwest, and there are no rules. So you can have a piece of the regular Crown Forest around here, around a chunk of land, and strict rules apply, and at least in forest management planning and inspections, follow-ups, that sort of thing. And then you hit a big parcel of land that's privately owned where they can do what the hell they want. There are no rules on forest. They can just come and strip off all the trees, do whatever they want, sell them in any way, shape, or form, and they don't have to replant, and they don't have to do any kind of proper long-term management of the landscape. So I wonder if that's the root of this, where we got this question, because people, when I was up there as a commissioner, people were quite upset that because they saw the contrast. They saw that in some areas on the Crown land, some pretty responsible forestry is going on. There were some bad actors, but basically rules were being attempted to be applied. But on these big, large tracts of private land, there were no rules, and you saw the consequences of that to wildlife, to land management, to erosion, to all the other things. So that's basically the quick answer then, is that there are strict rules in mining. There are a number of regulations. They apply anywhere on the Crown land that you want to mine. And there's the forestry industry has got elaborate rule system. At Earthroots, we have had our problems with some of the forest management plans, but at least there's a framework that you have written in law that we can deal with and work within. But on these big tracts of private land, no rules.
Okay, we're coming up to half an hour, so I've got two more questions, unless we've got something from additional questions from participants, and then we'll wind it up. So now we're going from Northwestern Ontario all the way to kind of the globe. Do you think that the Ontario government will support and implement the Action Plan 2030 recommendations?
Well, that's interesting. There's an interesting, I think you've fallen for it, friend. The term Action Plan 2030 is actually about the Great Lakes.
Oh,
there
yet
is
again
also,
shows that I don't.
Well, no, it's a quite a legitimate mistake to make, because the Action Plan 2030 was a report done. I actually co-chaired it. It was a $500,000 project on the Great Lakes, funded by Environment Canada. Although we did talk to the province to an extent. I'll go into it in a minute. But then, unfortunately, when they had the recent international meeting on the climate change, they call it the Climate Action Plan 2030. So now we had the term first, but it's obviously causing confusion, and it's understandably so. So I think this person, because they correctly call it Action Plan 2030, and they said, and they asked if the Ontario government will support and implement the Action Plan 23 recommendations. Well, as I say, I myself and the former Commissioner for Sustainable Development of Quebec, we co-chaired this initiative over about a 9-month plan. It was quite an extensive thing. It focused on 4 major problems in the Great Lakes and put a set of recommendation approaches for those major problem areas, with a thought of getting some action, because the Great Lakes has been neglected. It's fallen into neglect by the Canadian government, in our opinion, and certainly Ontario government as well. To their credit, the Americans have approved under the Obama legislation, regulation, the administration, they approved several $1 billion worth of work on the Great Lakes long term, and we were trying to get the Canadian government to sort of maybe not spend as much as the Americans can, but to get involved, re-involved, and reconnected. And of course, the Great Lakes, the Upper Lakes are all an Ontario jurisdiction on the Canadian side, and the St. Lawrence, which is the lower part, is all Quebec jurisdiction on the Canadian side. So it was a joint Canadian Government of Canada initiative, but we reached out to both provinces for participation. And we came up to sort of, just to give people an idea of what this was about. It was a quite good piece of work, I thought. We had a lot of very good qualified people involved. And we just constantly said, looking after the Great Lakes is such an immense and complex problem. So many facets to it that you can't tackle everything all at once. So we thought then we were working with all the organizations that relate to the Great Lakes, the Great Lakes Council of Mayors, Great Lakes Mayors, the fisheries, joint Canada-US fisheries organizations and such. And they looked at 4 major areas. They were environmental toxics and how to reduce those or get a handle on the toxic substances that move the Great Lakes. Something that the governments used to do, the federal government used to do extensively and has backed down on, about how we can address that problem with more modern approaches. As well, something that affected people in all regular people, and that's his beaches. The making sure that beaches are swimmable, and we looked at how they were being regulated, and how we suggested some recommendations on how new water analysis techniques, new methods of classifying beaches could be applied to improve and make the beaches not only more usable without being flagged for longer periods of time, but also to anyone, the small number that need remedial work, to make sure that the remedial work is done. The other ones, on climate change is just too big a question for the Great Lakes. There's so many aspects to it, but we looked at the effect of erosion and flooding associated with the Great Lakes with the fluctuating climate, which has been a real problem. Identified areas throughout the Great Lakes that could do with some special local planning in that regard. Missing one, so toxics, climate change. Oh, phosphorus. Phosphorus, of course, is the enrichment of the Great Lakes, and especially in the west end of Lake Erie, it's particularly a problem, and the algae blooms that are occurring and such things. So we look at most of that's from agriculture. So how could we handle that problem differently with modern technology? And we came up with a plan. So we put all those recommendations all together in something called Action Plan 2030. And I presented it to the federal government, paid the bill, so certainly give it to them, but we presented it both to the government of Ontario and the government of Quebec as well. And this person is saying, well, is Ontario going to do anything about it? And I guess the easy answer is there's certainly no indication they are, but I think the more optimistic answer on this one is that those 4 things I mentioned are such real problems and ongoing and significant that the province won't be able to escape paying attention to them as they become more and more pressing as time goes on. And I think the Ontario government will realize one by one, it's better if we did this in conjunction with the federal government in Quebec, like it's being suggested, rather than have to deal with the electorate who are angry about closed beaches or about toxics accumulating, who are angry about the algae blooms in the west end of the lake. And so, I think it'll come up, it will mature into something that the province has to participate in, but it's clearly going to take some time because there hasn't been any tremendous interest in the environment in recent years. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Final question, which is very relevant given that we are 3 days away from Election Day. The questioner wrote, most Ontarians do not know anything about the Conservatives' attempts to dismantle the environmental laws in Ontario. How can this be better communicated? And how can we prevent future provincial governments from doing the same?
It's a good question, a tough one to answer from the point of view. I mean, it's very, very true that the governments have, been abandoning and dismantling environmental laws that have been in place for almost 50 years in Ontario. Ontario used to lead the world in environmental regulation, at least as a jurisdiction. The very first Environmental Protection Act in the world was in the United States, but shortly after, the second one in the world was in Ontario. The Endangered Species Act, second in the world, was in Ontario. The Environmental Assessment Act, which was a marvelous breakdown through in planning, very innovative for its day, Also first in, I think firsts in the world, but certainly very early on in Ontario. All of those acts, by the way, were passed by progressive conservative governments back in the 70s. An interesting contrast. But things are being dismantled in the last 2 years. Certainly the Office of the Environmental Commissioner. I was the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario for 15 years. That office no longer exists. So the rights of Ontario to be notified and comment on major government decision-making, whether policy decisions or acts or regulations that affect the environment. We used to have that, we still have nominally, but the person, the environmental commissioner that was in charge of holding the government accountable, by calling them out, that role doesn't exist anymore. So the legislative environmental bill of rights still exists, but it's been very much reduced. That's just one example, but systematically the Environmental Assessment Act has been under attack and modification several times. The Endangered Species Act has been brought under attack, and the Crown Forest Sustainability Act no longer has an endangered species responsibility in it. From the Endangered Species Act, that they say they have internal rules that provide some protection, and they do provide some protection, but not the kind of protection that the Endangered Species Act provided. There's other compromises and the Crown Forest management area. So systematically, things have been dismantled. And in fact, Earthroots, our organization, because it's happened more than once, but back on Bill, something they call Bill 195, one of these omnibus bills that was changing a number of these things. The government put through this, and they didn't do the required public notification and consultation that's required by law under the Environmental Bill of Rights. And Earthroots and Ontario Nature and some private citizens end up taking the government of Ontario to court for violating their own act, their own legislation. And in fact, we won. Now the courts ruled, yes, the government of Ontario violated its own legislation. Now, it's a nominal win because we can't reverse what they passed because of that, but it is unique. First of all, it's a slap in the wrist, and hopefully it won't happen again, but of course it has happened again. Already there's another court battle. We're not involved in that one. But the point is that systematically, they've been withdrawing and reducing the effectiveness of environmental regulation, and they're getting it away with it. So I think what do we? The question relates to how do we do something about that? Well, first of all, let me put some responsibility on the opposition. That in the Legislative Assembly, the government can do all these things, and we've had a majority government, so the majority government can make big changes, and they're guaranteed to pass and become law. The main protection in our system of government that we have is for the opposition. It's right there in the legislature, has to vote on something, and they can say, well, we voted against it. Yeah, but were you thumping the desk? Were you raising the thing? Were you telling the people what's going on? Were you demanding that the public be informed of what the changes and the significance of those? I didn't hear a lot of that. And so, so we end up with Earthroots, little Earthroots, having to take the government to court to get the courts to rule that they've broken their own laws. There's something missing from that. The biggest missing piece is that the opposition parties in the legislature have to do their bit. And that's, if they're loud enough, that'll get picked up in the media, and the media will tell the people. But right now, the people don't know what's going on. They don't have the benefit because the media is not talking about it, because the opposition is talking about it. So I think that's, we're in a week coming up to an election here very shortly. But the pressure has to be on the government, has to be brought most effectively by the members of the opposition parties in the legislature of Ontario. So tell your members that you want what you want. Tell the people who are running, if you get the chance, to tell them what you're concerned about, whether you want to know what's going on, and you don't see you want to know why you want it to stop. You want to be more consultative in the decision making about the environment. You want a chance to speak out against some of these things. And unless we do that, this government or the next government is going to keep on eroding our environmental legislation. So it's a serious business, but we've got to get the opposition doing their job.
Okay. Well, That's it for our May 30th Provincial Election 2022 video podcast. For those joining us live, thanks for participating and for your great questions and comments. We hope you enjoyed it and we hope you learned something useful. Please share this link with your friends and family, and please consider making a donation to Earthroots so we can continue protecting wilderness and wildlife through events like this. Finally, this is our last podcast since Thursday, June 2nd, of course, is Election Day. So please vote. Please get your friends and family to vote, and please vote for the environment. Thank you very much for watching and take care. Good night.
Good night.